Welcome back to Educator.com. Today we're going to discuss political parties and the roles they play in government. So let's take a look. All right, so first off, we're going to define what a political party is. That's going to be fairly simple. And then we're going to review the various roles of political parties. So what role, what function do they play in the American political system? And then we're going to identify different types of party systems. Obviously, we're going to be focusing what goes on in the United States, but as a frame of reference, what do other countries utilize in terms of different types of party systems? And then finally, we're going to establish what exactly do political parties, what do they actually do? So that's obviously something that you want to know for the AP exam. And then we're going to examine different factors that influence party membership. And one thing I like to do is I like to discuss the history of the two-party system in American politics. As one of the things I actually did in my AP government classes is have my students on the first day of class memorize all the presidents, years in office, and political party. Now, the reason why I have them do that, it really isn't to know the particular presidents. I mean, yes, is it good to know that James Buchanan was our 15th president? There's some benefit to that, but it's more important to know that, let's say the 7th president of the United States was Andrew Jackson, and he was a Democrat. And so if you just take it as a whole, then you see that, the alternating patterns of political parties, you get a better sense of how this two-party system works and how it basically evolved over the 200 plus years in American government. So that's why I think it's important. Is it absolutely required to pass the AP exam? Probably not, but it doesn't hurt to know. And then we're going to look at what is the role of third parties today. So I'll give you different examples and what function does a third party play in the United States today? All right, so what is a political party? So if you want to take the absolute basic definition, it's a voluntary association of people who seek to control the government through a shared vision of how the government should operate. So basically, you have people of similar ideologies. Now, when you talk about political ideology, whether it's conservative or liberal, I mean, basically, for the most part, again, this doesn't necessarily have to correlate 100%, but conservatives will generally be in the Republican Party, and liberals will tend to be in the Democrat Party. Now, is it possible to have a liberal in the Republican Party? Yes. Is it possible to have a conservative in the Democrat Party? Again, it is possible, although I would venture to say that's a little bit more rare to have a conservative Democrat than a liberal Republican. But again, over the past however so many years, you've had that split. So ideology doesn't necessarily dictate what political party you will belong to. But again, conservatives will have a shared vision, and they will generally align themselves with a particular party, and as will liberals who have a certain ideology. But political parties are the actual memberships rather than the way you view the role of government. So political parties, along with interest groups, they serve similar functions. The media and elections, they serve as the linkage mechanism that brings people in government together. Now, again, that sounds kind of odd to say, oh, it's a linkage mechanism, but the AP curriculum makes great use out of this linkage. So you have the government and the people. What are the institutions that link together people and the government? And political parties, they're one of several institutions that basically link people to government. Okay, so while interest groups and political parties may share similar values and functions, the main difference is that a political party will nominate individuals for office. So again, the role of an interest group, it may share some interests with the Democrat Party, but ultimately the political party, they're in there to to win elections and basically take control of the government. So the major goal, again, not the only goal, but the major goal, again, if not the only one, of a political party is to get its members elected. So again, that's the number one overriding goal. So you can argue, what is the goal of a congressman? And you could say they want to do all these different things for the people. They want to enact public policy reform. But if you think about it, the real goal of a politician is to get reelected. And again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It might sound really selfish, but if you as a political party, if your party doesn't get into power, then you don't have the power to enact any type of public policy reforms that you plan on doing. So what are the roles of political parties? So we'll take a look at three different types of roles that political parties play. There's a party in the electorate, there's a party in government, and the party in organization. So we'll look at what each of these represent. Party in the electorate is basically all the people who associate themselves with a political party. So if I were to ask you, are you a Republican or Democrat? And you say, oh, I'm a Democrat. Or if you say, I'm a Republican, then you get a sense of, well, you belong to that party. Now, you don't necessarily have to be a registered Republican or necessarily. This is more the idea that are you more of a Republican-leaning district, or is that area more of a Democrat-leaning district? The reality is that over the course of the 20th century, political parties have had lesser influence because of the introduction of the primary system and also the rise of independence. So today, more so than, let's say, in 1950, if you asked an individual, are you a Democrat or a Republican, a lot of individuals today would actually say neither, that they're independent. So the percentage, again, I'm giving you a rough approximation here, percentage of Democrats in the United States today might hover around 40%, whereas Republicans might be a little bit less, around 30%, but the number of undecided or independents, again, slightly different terminology, they're going to be closer to that 30%, 20 to 30% mark as well. So again, party in the electorate simply means, do you align yourselves with the Republican or Democrat party? Obviously, people can switch, and that's really the idea behind that. But again, the goal of the party is to try to connect with the American public by dealing with issues that resonate with them. So party in government, what does party in government represent? Well, this is all the elected and appointed officials at the local, state, and national level that represent their constituencies. Again, we're going to focus a little bit more on the federal government. There's plenty of state officials and local officials that are Republican or Democrat, but again, for the purposes of this course, it's good to understand primarily the federal structure of government. Example, in California, you have Republican House member Ed Royce, one of many. California has the most representatives representing the people, and he's represents the 39th district. And another example would be Democrat Senator Harry Reid, who's the House, or not the House, but the Senate Majority Leader in the Senate. So these are government officials that ran as the candidate for his party, and that's basically how most of the members in Congress align themselves. Now, you can absolutely run as an independent. You can also switch parties, and that actually has been done several times. But for the most part, you're going to align yourselves with one party, and you get elected based on the association to that party. And also, you have the party and organization. So these are all the people who work within the party organization, helping to raise money for candidates and organize convention and party functions. Two individuals that would fit this mold would be one individual by the name of Matt Cobble. I actually know this individual, Matt Cobble. He's a Republican, and he works for the local Republican Party Central Committee. So Republican Party Central Committee, he actually works and helps organize Republican Party events. On the other side, you have an individual named Clark Lee, a Democrat also a friend of mine, actually. He is the political director of the Los Angeles County Democratic Party. So again, his story, when he graduated college, he went directly into politics. Actually, it's kind of interesting, as an intern, when Arnold Schwarzenegger was running for governor in the state of California, Clark Lee actually, he dressed up in a chicken suit and protested Arnold Schwarzenegger's decision not to participate in a gubernatorial debate. So you have individuals that work as part of their party to try to promote the interests of either the Republicans or Democrats or even third parties, and they make a career out of it to try to convince people and mostly to mobilize members to again win elections. So our party, there's different types of party systems, and we'll discuss the one that's practiced most here in the United States. But yeah, the one-party system, the two-party system, which in the United States we pretty much have right now, and then you have a multi-party system. So exactly what exactly is a one-party system? Well, it's exactly like that. It's exactly how it sounds. There's only one party controls the government, and there exists little, if any, dissenting votes. Again, dictatorships usually might have only one party, maybe communist forms of government where any type of dissent is really not looked upon. But, in a one-party system, there's probably not a lot of freedom for the opposition party to express any type of discontent, or if you do so at the possible cost of your life. So that's basically a one-party system. It's probably generally not good to have just one party representing the people. You have the two-party system, and you can critique it for what it is, but it serves its purpose in the United States. So our electoral college system actually makes it hard for third-party candidates to win the presidency. So there's actually nothing in the Constitution or anywhere in our laws or statutes that say we will have a two-party system. It's just one of those informal things that developed. Again, even the founding fathers didn't envision us having a two-party system. There's no mention in the Constitution of political parties. But again, Republicans and Democrats, they've been basically the two parties since the mid-19th century. We basically used to be the two major parties prior to Republicans and Democrats. It used to be the Democrat Republicans and Democrats and Whigs. But when the Whig Party fell apart, the Republican Party kind of coalesced under Abraham Lincoln, and since then we've had this two-party system. You also have multi-party systems, and again, this is mostly found in Europe, in which multiple parties have power within the government, and usually there are no majority parties, and countries must govern through a coalition. So this is the idea: if there are three parties and one faction has 40%, 30%, and 30% of the support, it's possible that the two 30s, they combine together and they compromise on issues in order to have a coalition majority. But again, you don't see that much in the United States. What usually happens is maybe a successful third-party candidate or independent candidate will have an idea, and if that idea is adopted by one of the major parties or perhaps both, then the third-party candidate usually doesn't have a strong of a platform, and the issues absorbed within the party. So that's basically how third parties have worked, at least in the United States, over the past however many years. All right, so what do political parties actually do? So there are four things that they are known for doing here. One, they recruit candidates. Two, they nominate and support candidates for office, which is very similar, a natural follow-up from number one. They educate the electorate, and they organize the government. So the first thing that they do, they find individuals capable and willing, and that's the key, you gotta be willing to run for office, particularly if no incumbent is running, especially if there's a competitive race. Now, if it's a one-sided district, let's say in the area there's 70% Democrats and only 30% Republican, you're not going to find a whole lot of Republicans clamoring for that spot in the race. You generally will see that that race kind of being abandoned by the Republican Party, and it works for Democrats as well. But one of the goals that political parties do, they try to find up-and-coming candidates, up-and-coming spokespeople that can accurately articulate the visions of the political party. Again, another thing, they nominate and support candidates for office. So they're going to help with fundraisers and campaigns for its candidates. They educate the electorate. You can argue that political parties, they inform voters, usually through a mass mailer. They do what they can to try to convince, again, ultimately to get their members to go out and vote, but also inform them what their views are and how they would run the government should they be elected. And also, they organize the government. So the structure and organization, which we'll go over in our lecture about Congress, they control the structure and organization of Congress, which is based upon political party controls. For example, Speaker of the House and Senate Majority Leader. So again, as of 2014, the Democrats controlled the Senate, so Harry Reid being the Senate Majority Leader. And in the House, you had John Boehner being the House, being a Republican-dominated chamber. So in 2010, actually, before the 2010 election, the Democrats actually had control of the House, but they lost control with Nancy Pelosi losing her speakership in 2010, and ultimately it went to John Boehner. So party identification and membership. So what are some prerequisites, or what are some factors that allow you to associate with a particular party? Well, again, no money is required to associate with a particular political party. If you want to officially be a Republican or Democrat, you just simply register as such, and you would be able to vote in that primary, again, depending on how that particular primary is adjusted. But that's basically, there's no cost. You can switch political parties, as often as you'd like. There's no requirement. And also, if you're a Republican, you can still vote Democrat in the general election and vice versa. So there's no law that requires you as a Republican not to vote for Obama, or as a Democrat not to vote for Mitt Romney. So while your political party is the biggest determinant in how you vote, it's certainly not the only determinant. You can decide, you're a Democrat, but you just don't like Obama, so you don't vote for him. Similarly, you could be a Republican, and for some reason you like Hillary Clinton, and you decide to vote for Hillary Clinton, assuming she's the 2016 nominee. So it helps identify, but there's no requirement one way or another to be a member of a political party, and you can switch whenever you want. So again, you can choose to be a Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, or choose no political party. So there's all these different options that you have. Now, what are different factors influencing party identification? Well, again, ideology. As I mentioned, conservatives will tend to be Republican, and Democrats, they attract the liberal base. Education. The more education that you have, the more likely you are going to vote. As far as political parties, it's interesting. As the more education you have, and that's related to wealth, you become maybe more Republican. But as you go into higher levels of education, maybe into PhD level, then it shifts back to support for Democrats. Income. Clearly, those that are more affluent, they tend to support the Republican Party more. Those that don't tend to have as much money, the working class, they tend to favor Democrats. Occupations. There's some occupations. Union members will tend to favor Democrat parties. Small businesses will tend to favor Republicans. Race. One of the things that is good for Democrats when they're running for president is that pretty much the first 3 electoral votes found in Washington, D.C., they will tend to pretty much go for the Democrat candidate, no matter who it is, simply because in the Washington, D.C. area, the population is about 90% African American, and African Americans will tend to vote Democrat about 80-90% of the time. Hispanics, they will vote Democrat most of the time, maybe around 60-70%, again, depending on the region and candidate. Whites will tend to vote Republican. Again, so, it's not an exact breakdown, but again, that's been the trend in American politics. Gender, there's something called the gender gap. Women will actually tend to vote Democrat, not overwhelmingly, but significant enough so that Democrats have pretty much won the female vote, particularly the single female votes. And, women tend to actually, at least in past elections, women actually outnumbered the amount of votes that men have cast. Religion. Certain religions will cater more towards Republican Party versus the Democrat Party, but the more religious you are, the more likely you are to vote. Protestants will tend to vote Republican, whereas Catholics and Jews will tend to vote Democrat. If you identify with a religious organization, again, your likelihood of voting increases. Marital status, as far as married individuals, they tend to vote more so than singles. And then geography, depending on what area you live in, that could also be a factor in terms of political party affiliation. To kind of give a very simple breakdown, the coastal areas like New York and California will tend to be a little bit more Democrat, and maybe the rural Midwestern areas, states like Wyoming will tend to be more Republican. So again, there's a lot of different factors as to why you tend to align yourself with the Republican Party or Democrat Party, but one thing is for sure that is tested, the fact that your political party affiliation is the highest correlating factor in who you will vote for in the next election. So the two-party tradition in the United States, so how did that plan out here? In Federalist 10, James Madison wrote about the divisive nature of factions. Now, did he mean that political parties were factions? I mean, they do serve to sometimes serve the interests of the faction or political party over the interests of the American people, but it's something that informally developed. George Washington never officially aligned himself with one party, although you can argue he was a little bit more closely aligned to John Adams and the Federalists. But from 1789 to 1800, basically the Federalists, or the strong national government party, they basically were one of the two parties, the other being the Democrat Republicans, and they favored states' rights. Now in 1800, 1860, pretty much you had Democrat domination with a sprinkling of Whigs. Now what's kind of interesting is that you had 4 Whig presidents out of 5 presidents, and during a time span, and both elected Whig presidents actually died in office. William Henry Harrison, our 9th president, served basically a month before he died. He gave the longest inaugural speech in the history of the presidency. Problem is he caught pneumonia and he died, so that's what he's famous for in 1841. And John Tyler became president upon his death, and then Zachary Taylor basically became president after Polk was or Zachary Taylor became the president after James Polk was one-termed out. Zachary Taylor became president from 1849 to 1850, and he died shortly thereafter in 1850. Interesting note was that this Whig president, historians speculated that he might have been poisoned. So again, back then there was no technology to determine whether or not he was poisoned or not, but 20th century scholars, they thought, you know what, let's exhume his body, and that's what they did to see if he was poisoned, and they realized no, he was not poisoned. So they put Zachary Taylor back in his grave. So that's basically what happened from 1800 to 1860. You had a lot of Democrat presidents, and you had four basically Whig-aligned presidents. But the Whig Party eventually just kind of gave way to the Republican Party. So from 1860 to 1932, you basically had Republican or GOP domination. So during the Civil War and post-Civil War, you had a lot of Republican-dominated, especially the presidency. But from 1932 to 1968, especially with four elections in which Franklin Roosevelt won the presidency, you saw a Democratic resurgence, which again, it was led by FDR's ability to create a New Deal coalition. And you can argue that since 1968 to the present, we've had a lot of divided government and gridlock. So, you have a lot of, not a lot of going on, a lot of political rancor, but, a lot of Americans, they do that specifically to give the Republicans Party for the executive and maybe the Democrats the power in the legislative. So that's basically kind of a brief summary of what's happened since the inception of the Constitution. So third parties, what are different types of third parties? So we'll go over four different types. You have the ideological parties, the splinter parties, the single issue parties, and the protest parties. So the ideological parties would be like the communist, socialist, or libertarian party. So, depending on the view of government, so they have a certain worldview in how the government ought to function, and they have candidates that have consistent ideologies. And then you have splinter parties, so parties that basically form usually around a single personality when the candidate loses the nomination of the major party. Probably the classic case of a splinter party was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt and the Bull Moose Party of 1912. You had the incumbent president William Howard Taft, and he was basically Teddy Roosevelt's choice to succeed him as president. And in 1912, after one term, apparently Teddy Roosevelt didn't like the job that William Howard Taft was doing, and so he challenged him in the Republican primary. Unfortunately, he didn't have as much support, but he had enough popularity that he ran as a third-party candidate, created the Bull Moose Party in 1912, and you can basically see how the third-party candidate served to siphon away votes from otherwise Republican votes, and it basically gave the election to the Democrat Woodrow Wilson in 1912. And another case would be George Wallace and the American Independent Party of 1968. So that was a splinter party that came about from basically a segregationist wing of the Southern Democrats, and it really helped Richard Nixon to the presidency because you had a divide and conquer strategy with the Democrats splitting their vote. You had Richard Nixon gaining enough of a plurality everywhere else to gain enough electoral votes to win the election. And you also have single issue parties, Free Soil, Prohibition, Right to Life Party. Now again, these parties generally don't gain a lot of steam because, other parties may adopt certain measures and basically swallow up the issues that are important to them. And again, it's not really governed by anything other than one particular issue. And then you have protest parties, so parties that form primarily because of economic discontent. So like the Greenback Party, the Populist Party, and one third party that's not quite a party yet, but has major influence, at least within the Republican Party, is the Tea Party. So it should be kind of interesting to see, what the future holds for the Republican Party and whether or not Tea Party, a third party, or is it one of those things where, it's not officially in there, but you have a permanent split, possibly within the Republican Party. And so let's take a look at certain successful third-party candidates. Probably one of the most successful third-party candidates in recent political history is probably Ross Perot. In 1992, he actually polled above the 15% threshold, and he therefore participated in debates with Republican George Bush, who was the incumbent president, and Democrat Bill Clinton. So mostly the presidential debates are limited to the Republican and Democrat candidate, but because Ross Perot, who wasn't quite a third party yet, he was just an independent in that particular year, because he polled above that 15%, he was included in the presidential debate. So that was one atypical election, and you can argue that without Ross Perot's presence, George Bush would have been elected as the president. Ross Perot actually received 19% of the vote. So clearly that shows that there is an electorate out there that might not be satisfied with our current two-party system that we have. Now, with that 19% of the national vote, how many electoral votes did Ross Perot win? And the answer is a grand total of 0. And that's the thing with third-party candidates. Third-party candidates that have broad support, but not targeted support, they're generally not going to win any electoral votes because it's a winner-take-all system in basically all the states except Nebraska and Maine. But a plurality will give you all the electoral votes. Whereas candidates like George Wallace in 1968 actually did win electoral votes because in a three-way contest in some of the southern states, George Wallace actually drew a plurality. So one of the things working against third-party candidates is their inability to get any electoral votes because their support is generally going to be dispersed throughout the country, and it makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to get any electoral votes. John Anderson, another successful political or third-party candidate or independent candidate, he won 7% of the popular vote in 1980. So he was a Republican House member, but he ran as a third-party candidate, and he won 7% of the vote that year, which, again, not going to win any electoral votes, but you can argue it's fairly significant. Ralph Nader won a very significant 3% of the popular vote in 2000 as part of the Green Party. And there's some folks that say without Ralph Nader's presence, you would have had a President Al Gore rather than a President George Bush. Now, in 1988, though, sometimes you have third-party candidates that don't make much of an impact. 1988 was one of them. Ron Paul actually won 0.5% of the popular vote in 1988 as part of the Libertarian Party. Shortly thereafter, he quit the Libertarian Party and he re-ran again as a Republican, and in 2008, 2012 ran as a Republican, although he did so more so that he could kind of be considered a serious candidate, whereas if you're a third-party candidate, it's hard to be taken seriously. So even if you have more libertarian views, it's really hard to have your viewpoints expressed unless you subject yourself to this two-party system that we have. And are there advantages of this system? Absolutely. Are there disadvantages to that system as well? Absolutely. Now the million-dollar question is, will there ever be a third-party or independent candidate to become president? And the answer is we don't know. I mean, pretty much it would probably take someone who's extremely wealthy, perhaps a billionaire, to pull this off. It definitely is possible. It's just one of those things that hasn't materialized as yet. So example number 1, which of the following is not a responsibility of political parties? So what are the things that political parties don't do or are responsible for? Do they organize the government? Absolutely. They're the ones that figure out the leaders. Do they represent special interests? Doesn't look like they actually do. They try to represent the members, so it doesn't look like that's the case. Do they recruit candidates? Absolutely. They want to find appealing candidates who are articulate, that can win elections, basically. Do they educate voters? Absolutely. And do they raise campaign money? Absolutely. So one thing that they don't do, they don't represent special interests. And that's the role of political action committees or interest groups. Example number 2. In which presidential election did a third-party candidate have the least amount of impact? Okay, so 4 of these did have impact. Which one did not? 1912, that was the year of, you had Woodrow Wilson, and he was the Democrat, versus, and you had the incumbent, you had William Howard Taft. And he was a Republican. And the third party candidate at that time was Teddy Roosevelt, who was part of the Bull Moose Party. So clearly there was a huge impact that Teddy Roosevelt had, a very big personality. So this is definitely not the answer, because there was an impact. 1968, you had George Wallace. You had George Wallace as the segregationist candidate. Again, the third party candidate here was Ron Paul, but less than 1% of the vote, not very significant. 1992, you had Ross Perot, very significant, won 19% of the vote, didn't win any electoral votes. And actually, what's interesting, in 1996, he didn't run as an independent. He actually was a third party candidate, but he got less support, and his appeal in 1996 was not nearly as large as his appeal in 1992. And then finally, in 2000, you had Ralph Nader. So even though he didn't have as much support as some of the other third-party candidates, that 3% proved fairly critical to George W. Bush. So the answer is C, 1988. Okay, next question here. Which amendment to the Constitution formally established the two-party system in the United States? Okay, was it the 12th Amendment? What is the 12th Amendment? The 12th Amendment basically says that there's a separate election for the president and VP. Okay, so that basically fixed a flaw that we had because of the development of the two-party system, but didn't establish a two-party system. It just recognized the realities of a two-party system and adjusted our electoral college as such. The 17th Amendment deals with the direct election of senators. And again, that basically just gave more power to the people rather than the state legislatures. The 22nd Amendment dealt with limiting a president to 2 terms or 10 years of office. So 2-term or 10 years in office for the president. And the 28th Amendment, that allowed 18-year-olds to vote. Not that they weren't allowed to vote before, but states had the discretion on whether to put the age limit to 19 or 20 or 21 even. 26th Amendment basically took that matter out of state hands, and once you turn 18, you're allowed to vote. So you can't be discriminated based on that factor. So the answer is none of the above. So this one, there is no amendment to the Constitution that establishes a two-party system. It's just one of those informal developments that came about just as a result of human desire to congregate and organize in a competition. And the final example, a condition in which one political party controls the presidency while another political party controls Congress is referred to as which of the following? So is it alignment? No, it's not. Is it realignment? Realignment would be when one political party takes over from control after a long period of time, a realigning election, so to speak. That's not it. Divided government, that is the correct answer. Now, divided government means that there's going to be a lot of gridlock, but it's not called gridlock government. There is gridlock in a divided government, but it's not a gridlock government. And gerrymandering is basically if you have a certain area, a congressional district or state, and you map it out to try to maximize advantage for one particular political party. But that's basically not the situation. That's usually a situation that occurs when one party dominates rather than what we have today, which is a divided government. Thank you for watching educator.com.